Come on in. Hey.
Can we ask you to move this way? We got a big group.
Yeah, come on in. Gather round.
Sorry. Oh, great, you're up.
Oh, and I forgot to tell you, we're filming, so don't be afraid of the funny man with the camera. and ladies, move on down so you can get it better.
Yeah, come on over.
Okay.
Hi there, I'd like to welcome everybody to our Hats and Headwear Vault Tour. My name is Sigrid Benson. I am a public history student at CSUS, and I'm going to begin today with a chronology of hats and headwear fashion. We have at this first table hats from the late 1800s. We'll move on to teens and 20s, 30s and 40s, and 50s and 60s. But to begin, I'd like to start at the beginning over here. I'm glad to see quite a few hats in the crowd today. All right, so most of our collection begins with headwear after the 1860s. So I'd like to point you first of all to this piece right here. Does anyone out there know what the difference between a hat and a bonnet is? Yeah, that's one thing.
The bonnet tied onto the chin.
Definitely. Yeah. Yeah, so originally bonnets had a very functional use, and that's to shade the face from the sun. One thing that starts to happen as we move forward in the 1800s is that because of the popularity of the parasol, bonnets start to become smaller. And in this example here, you see that the brim is actually quite small and really wouldn't function to shade your face from the sun. This particular style was introduced in the Godet's Ladies book, which was kind of like the fashion magazine of the time, as the Empire bonnet. So this is a late bonnet style. As we progress through the end of the century, bonnets just become smaller and smaller. This piece right here, which is actually quite a bit later, 1890s, would have been worn completely perched on the top of your head, like this example right here, and I'll pass this around. But you can really see the bonnet shape and how it has adapted as headwear styles shifted. They did so very much in response to hairstyles. So as we move forward, the chignon, which would have been gathered up towards the back of the head, kind of moves up, and hats get smaller and move forward. So we have this beautiful example here from the 1870s. It's a blue velvet Mary Stuart style hat, and you can see the little point here that would have been worn low and forward, and that was named after Mary Queen of Scots and the style of headwear that was popular in her time. Here in the middle, if you get a chance to take a peek, there's a picture of quite a few generations of women. And one thing that we think about when we're looking at the different styles over time is that women wore hats, and they were introduced at different times, but really you can't always say, oh, this is from this time, this is from that time, because, for example, the bonnet style continued to be worn by elderly women throughout, you know, the rest of the 1800s and even a little bit forward. So that style became associated with a certain, certain age, certain style. So we always have to remember when we're looking at these that we really look at dates of introduction of the style. So let's see, as we move on, here we have one of our adopt an artifact items, and these two here represent styles that were popular towards the turn of the century. One thing that is really good to take a look at as we walk by, and afterwards we can all kind of file through and take a closer peek. This piece and this piece here both have some really interesting straw elements as trim. This has beads that are actually made from straw, and then the trim that you see winding through this piece sewn over the tulle is actually straw braid as well. Towards the turn of the century, one of the things that we see is hats get really big and they really take up space and have a presence in the room, and they really become kind of the focal point of women's outfits. Does anyone have any idea what we might be using these dangerous looking tools here for? Yeah. So think of, you know, the other day it was pretty windy here in Sacramento. If you were walking down the street with that hat, it might be pretty hard to keep it on with the wind blowing. So one of the reasons that we see the crown styles getting deeper is because women were wearing large pompadour hairstyles. So not only did the hairstyles have to fit under the crown of the hat, but they also served to harness the hat. You would take the hat pin, you would push it through your crown, through your hairstyle, and out the other side.
Most women have long hair that they put up?
Yeah, yeah, at the time it was, and especially here towards the turn of the century, bigger was definitely better. As we move on here to the teens, one of the ideals of beauty was a very young, innocent look that kind of harkened to the soldier's girlfriend. We have the Great War going on, and the youthful innocence of the young girl imagined to be waiting at home for her boy to return was very much an attractive look, and these hats with these huge crowns created the aspect of a girl peeking out from under the brim of her mother's hat. And here we have one example that is a stiff crown, and then we've got the soft crown, but they both accommodate still the large hairstyles and that cute, innocent look. One of the things that changes with the 20s is the hair, and the hats again adapt to popular hairstyles. In the 20s, women start cropping their hair into a bob. Another really popular style was the Eton crop, which was even shorter, and so it was probably one of the more masculine looks that had come into fashion at the time. So these large, wide brims, they start to kind of morph, and when we think of the 20s, we often think of the cloche, which means bell, for the shape that really hugged your head, and you could do that because hair was fashionably short. Interestingly enough, though, the first hat that was called a cloche was something that was very, very similar to this piece right here, and it was inaugurated in about 1917 by a woman named Lucy Hamar. And as time moved forward, the brims, this oval brim, got smaller, and you can see the relationship between this early 20s hat and these cloches here, where the brim kind of takes different shapes. You put it in, use it, you design it in different materials, floppy, and it really becomes kind of the hat of the decade. When we get a chance, this pamphlet here was published by our own Weinstock and Lubin department store, and this is 1923 actually, and they're recommending to women to no longer ask, should I wear a cloche? Is that the hat for me? They're saying the question now is, what kind of cloche should I wear? And then they go on to recommend different styles for different face shapes and, you know, sharp features versus rounded features, angular, etc. Recommending the large, soft, or close-fitting style depending on your own look.
Question.
Yes.
These hats that still have more brim, did they wear them angled or more straight on? Or?
I think they were more, well, this one I think would be more straight on. This one might be a little more angled. I think it's, yeah, it depends. Yeah, definitely.
Is this horsehair?
I believe this one is, yeah.
Horsehair.
Yeah.
The netting?
The straw between the two hats on the hat
Yes.
form. Could you tell us about that?
This one is an early 20s style,
Straight on?
actually. Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
With the decoration on the side.
Right, on the side. And this one, like many of the hats in our collection, they have been worn and used and loved, and we receive them as they are. And you can see here there's stitching indicating that there probably was a large band of some kind of decorative trim adding to the look here. All right, and if I can invite you to move this way, we get into our hat selection from the 30s and 40s. And keep in mind that, you know, we have a pretty large collection, about 450 hats, and so we just brought out a couple examples of each decade to share with you. One of the things that's really interesting about hats in the 30s, Greta Garbo popularized the style of the kind of masculine hat, asymmetrically worn, pulled over one eye, and this is a good example of that. But another interesting thing to note is the use of felt, which we begin to see in cloches in the 20s, but really doesn't become a main fabric used in hats until the 30s. At that time, the bob kind of evolves into a looser, more feminine hairstyle with the Marcel wave, the permanent wave, and women wanted to show that, and so the hats become smaller, like this one for example. They hug the back of the head and they allow those curls to be highlighted. In the 40s, one of the really interesting things that happened in fashion was the reaction to the garment restrictions that in 1942 were issued by the War Productions Board to limit fabric use by the garment industry. Hats, however, were exempt from that limitation, so women really used hats as a way to express their creativity and their fashion and their style, as a way of highlighting their utility fashion that that the war demanded. In the 50s, we see smaller hats such as this princess style. We also see the asymmetrical and sculptured hats, such as this one. And one dominant feature of hats in the 50s that is helpful sometimes when you're trying to figure out when a hat that you might have is from is that, generally speaking, they went away from using linings for hats in the 50s. Hat lining. Yeah. So up to then, generally, the hats were lined, and at this point, they ceased to be.
They also had sizes.
Yes. Yeah.
which they don't anymore.
Are there one size for all?
You know, it would go 22.5. It's the diameter
Of the head.
And so you get one in the size that would fit you rather than just one you have to adapt to.
All right, so we're just going to quickly breeze through this 50s and the 60s here. One of the things that happens as people start wearing hats less, things such as these whimsies become very common when you felt like you needed to wear a hat, but you didn't really want to wear a complete getup. You could throw something like this on and satisfy that requirement without too much fuss. And here in the very last bit, we've got some pieces from the 60s, really influenced by a lot of the mod and op art that was quite the rage at the time. And it's the last gasp of everyday kind of hat use. And I think designers really took advantage of the time they had, and they really came up with exaggerated styles.
Jackie Kennedy wore a hat.
Yes,
Quite often, didn't she?
she did. This is an example of a pillbox. And when she was working with Halston to design the pillbox that she's so known for, she asked him to design something that she could wear and would enable her to be photographed from many angles and that wouldn't obstruct her face. And so his answer to that kind of design specification was the pillbox.
Question.
Yes.
That smallest one, that's like blue and green. How would that be worn?
This would have gone over like a bun, for example. Yeah, there's a. Yeah, this one has. Yeah, this has a little bit of an opening here, so you can fit it around. Yeah. All right, I'm going to ask you to come this way.
I'm going to start with this top hat back here, and this is actually a top hat. This is not made of fur. I know a lot of people think. I'm sorry. Yeah. Well, you know that wouldn't you think it was, but it's not. A lot of top hats often before that were made out of fur. I mean, that's one of the reasons why people came to this country originally, trap beavers for fur. No, this is actually a fabric that's made to look like fur. But originally top hats were made from fur, but this is a napped fabric. And this hat's from about 1916. No, well, we know it's from 1916, and the reason we know that is because it was worn by Mayor Gustav Gus Simmons. And it was worn for the 1916 celebration of the opening of the Yolo Causeway. And here's a picture of Mr. Simmons and probably the mayor of West Sacramento in a nice floral decked car. We don't know which one he is. You can't tell from this photo. There's two guys in top hats, and you can't see their faces. So we'll make a guess. We're not sure. The great thing too about the Yolo Causeway celebration is that it was actually a 3-day festivities, and as part of that, because the idea was that the causeway connected East and West, they had a marriage ceremony with East meets West. And here's a nice photo of East and West getting married. I'm going to pass that around for you guys to look at. Anyone know, we've got another top hat down here. It's made out of silk. Does anyone know the difference between a top hat and an opera hat?
Yeah, folded.
Very good. We've got an answer here. Folded. You know, everyone's seen Fred Astaire pop out his top hat and it pops up. Okay, well, that's called an opera hat. And the reason that those were developed is back in the 1820s, there was, the French wore really big top hats. They were so big they were called incredibles. And a gentleman noticed that they took up a lot of space in cloak rooms. And so he thought, we need to do something about this. So he actually devised a mechanism, spring mechanism, that would allow you to compress the hat and take up a lot less room. This box, hat box right here, is the box that this hat fit in. So it gives you an idea of how small they could be compressed to. And this is silk. Top hats went from being made out of fur to silk for an opera hat and some other napped fabrics. We have a picture here. This hat was worn by Franz Dix, who was the gentleman who organized the Sacramento Symphony Orchestra in 1924, and there's an image of him standing on the podium with the orchestra in Memorial Hall, and you can take a look at that when you go by. In the center back, we have a headdress from a Chinese theater that was in Cortland. The family owned the theater in the 1920s. And the thing about Chinese theater is that they had set characters, and that the audience could recognize who that character was by the costume and the headdress. So when someone walked out, they immediately knew that's the evil sorcerer or the queen. Here's a picture on a poster from San Francisco theater. And this gives you an idea of that kind of character with the headdress and the costume itself. We received this as a donation from the family with about 20 of these headdresses. Wonderful bit of local combination, local history of one of the ethnic communities here. Okay, I'm going to go to the guys here. Does anyone recognize, or can anyone tell me?
This is the U.S. Navy sailors' winter dress.
Wow, he even knows what's winter or summer. Well, yeah, and he's correct. It's a Navy hat from the USS Sacramento, which was originally built before World War I. It escorted ships during World War I. In World War II, the USS Sacramento was moored in Pearl Harbor. And when the strike came on December 7th, the crew members of the Sacramento shot down 2 Japanese airplanes, and they were also instrumental in rescuing members of the Oklahoma and other crews. This hat and a uniform, this hat was worn by a gentleman that was on the Sacramento, the USS Sacramento. His family donated his uniform and some personal papers of his. This is an image of the USS Sacramento. When the ship itself was decommissioned, the bell was removed, and the bell was then installed on the riverfront here in Sacramento by the Golden Bridge, so you can still take a look at that. Last thing I want to talk about on the table here is the Solon's hat for you baseball people. So the River Cats was not the first baseball team here. It was the Solons, and they started as part of the Pacific Coast League. And they started in the early teens. And it was basically considered like a farm team that then players went to other large teams, the Cardinals and the Brewers and the Sox. This baseball cap and the program here for about 1939. The thing I love is that the Solons, the word is the Greek word for senator. So it makes perfect sense here in the Capitol we would have a team named after the senators. Okay, let me have you shift focus over here, and I want to just tell you a little bit about Sacramento milliners and department stores, basically the 2 places where you would get hats. The first I want to talk about is Mrs. Peeler. Mrs. M.A. Peeler was a Sacramento milliner for about 30 years. We found her in city directories in 1870, and then in 1905 we found a story about her going into retirement. So we know that she was around there. She worked off of J Street, and I'm going to let you take a look at that. Now the nice thing is that we found the label of Mrs. Peeler in 2 of our hats, and you can it's very hard to see here her logo, and I'm going to pass around a picture of what that logo inside looks like, because it gives you a much better image than what I just showed you. But that logo is also inside this nice gold hat here. I don't want to pick this up because the inside's not real stable. But this gold hat was made to match this dress that was made for Mrs. McDonald here. And here's a great image of Mrs. McDonald wearing the hat, or the dress. I just wish she had the hat on. Unfortunately, she doesn't.
Wait, that's that dress.
That's that dress. Yes.
Little woman.
1889. Yes. So you could go to a milliner to get hats. The other place that everyone would go buy hats at department stores. And the two best known department stores in Sacramento, Hales and Weinstock and Lubin. And we have here a nice hat from 1935 that was owned by Edwina Fund, one of my favorite names. And here's Edwina and another hat from 1935. And how do we know that Edwina bought this at Hales? Because we have the receipt from Hale Department Store. So anyone want to guess how much did Edwina pay for her hat at Hales? $15. A lot more than, yeah. Now, anyone you think about there being to the Depression, but as someone said, she's wearing a mink coat. I don't think she needed to worry too much. The other place that people went was Weinstock and Lubin, and Weta bought this hat at Weinstock and Lubin. We also have the receipt for that one. It was actually even more, $27.50. So,
Keep them in the hat boxes, or did they just come in separately?
I can't remember personally in this particular instance if those came in or not. We've had hats come in both ways.
What year was it?
This is about 35. Unfortunately, the receipts.
Doesn't show on
The receipts, no. You would think that there would be a year. There wasn't, which is really irritating. So Hale Brothers was known more for its dry goods and mail order. Mrs. Peeler actually was the milliner who made Hale Brothers hats for Hale Brothers mail order. So that ad I was passing around was actually from the Hale Brothers catalog. So what we figure is that when people ordered hats from Hale's by mail, Mrs. Peeler made them for them and then sent them out. Weinstock and Lubin was probably known more for customer service and for a little higher end. When they finished their building in 1925, their new building, they had a fashion floor, and it's where women's dresses and their millinery shop was. So I'm out of time in this section, so I'm going to move us this way. Yes?
Are there currently any hat milliners in Sacramento?
Not milliners. There is a hat shop. It's called the Village Hat Shop, and as a matter of fact, we have to thank them for some of the hats our staff is wearing. It's in Old Sacramento. They're not that I know of as milliners.
In this section, we are highlighting the materials of the milliner's trade. Those include, broadly speaking, of course, artificial flowers, furs, feathers, and straw, although the millinery art is nothing if not a creative one, so all kinds of things could be used, but these are the staples. As you see here, feathers really figure prominently in hat making, headwear, etc. It became so fashionable in the 1880s to wear feathers on your hat as well as whole stuffed birds that it really created a problem because certain species were nearly decimated, and some in fact were, because of what was called the plume boom. In 1896, a woman named Harriet Hemingway, who was a Boston socialite, along with her cousin, Mina Hall, got together and decided that they were going to take a stand on behalf of species such as the egret and the heron, those were species that were hunted domestically, as well as many other species such as the bird of paradise and so forth, whose plumage was imported. They got together with their friends and they started having tea parties, inviting other socialites to come and hear their message about switching to wearing hats with artificial flowers, ribbon trim, etc., in order to save these species. They were so successful that as a result the National Audubon Society was formed. In about 1900, the Lacey Act was subsequently passed, and that provided for strictures against interstate commerce. So although states had their own laws protecting their domestic birds, there was nothing to say that hunters, plume hunters, couldn't hunt birds in one state take them across state lines and sell them in others. So the Lacey Act addressed this issue. It was difficult to enforce, however, and it wasn't really until about 1913 that the Migratory Bird Act took another step towards protecting species that, for example, migrated from Canada through the United States, and until that time weren't protected from plume hunters. As a result of that, later Japan and Mexico signed on to that legislation also to protect their migratory birds. One of the things that's a little difficult sometimes as far as identifying what plumage we're looking at is that feathers were so heavily manipulated. The millinery trade had a subset that were called the feather workers, and they did all kinds of things like dyeing, trimming, painting, the feathers, and curling. That was a very important one. Feather curler was a profession in the 1890s, as were other really specific professions like artificial flower maker and artificial flower brancher. These were all specializations for millinery workers. So one of the things that we see with the women who worked in both of these trades is that they were much better off if they learned both the feather and the flower trades, because it was a seasonal labor. Artificial flowers were associated with spring and spring hats, whereas plumes and feathers were associated with winter hats. So if you had both of those skills, you could be gainfully employed throughout the season. One of the reasons that ostrich plumes became so popular is that ostriches could be farmed and the plumes were plucked from the live bird. So that was one answer to the issue of decimation of the different species. This hat right here that we see in the middle with all these white ostrich feathers is another one of our Adopt an Artifact hats, and you can see the wire foundation peeking out from the brim. Women's hats were generally, up until the 30s, made with wire foundations covered in a buckram or a netting, and then things such as velvet or other fabrics covered that foundation. Another really common material obviously is straw, and over on that side of the table you've got a selection of different ways that straw was used for hats. It could be woven whole, so the whole hat would actually be started in the middle at the crown, and the hat would be woven all the way to the brim. Another way that straw was used was as plating. So the milliner could purchase the plating, which is essentially a braid, and it could be a braid from 5 strands, 7 strands, 13 strands, however many strands you want, and it would come in a big loop, and then the workers would fashion the foundation by sewing the braid to itself all the way around the wire foundation or around a hat block. A milliner's workshop would consist of a novice apprentice, a maker, and a maker was someone who made the foundation. The trimmer was the next step up, and she was the one who would do what was considered the most creative and the most artistic labor of designing the trim. So everything that we see here, these flowers and the feathers and so forth, those are trimming materials, and the trimmer would do that final touch. One of the unique things about the millinery industry is that, contrary to what you saw with dressmakers, the milliner was an entrepreneur who needed to have access to credit in order to keep stock of her materials, whereas a dressmaker might have her customers come to her with the material, the buttons, the trimming with which she would create the final garment, whereas milliners kept stock of trim and so forth, which required credit because she bought them wholesale. And so the milliners were really looked at as kind of the female aristocracy of the garment trade for that reason. As time went by and manufactured goods took over the millinery industry, the makers who made the foundations of the hats were kind of the first ones to lose their niche because wholesalers started selling, in addition to the trimming materials, ready-made hat foundations. And towards the turn of the century, you see all kinds of combinations of things happening. You have custom milliners who could create a hat for you from beginning to end. You saw millinery shops who sold hats, perhaps with ready-made foundations, and they added the trim. And then you saw millinery workrooms and department stores and so forth carrying completely ready-made hats, as well as doing trim work. So there are many permutations in that system that finally fell by the wayside as manufactured goods took over the market. But as you're passing this way into the next section, be sure to take a peek at this Hales catalog, which shows some of the trimmings that a woman could purchase to either trim her own hat or have someone else do it for her. Yes.
So when that hat gets recapped, does all the black material get replaced in total, or
no,
a little cover-up, or what?
What the conservator does is to clean and stabilize the hat, so the original materials will remain.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just clean and stabilize.
Yeah.
Basically, again, what do hats do? Why do you wear hats besides fashion? Well, basically function. Maybe they're symbolic, or they might tell you something about what organization or group you belong to. And I'm going to start here on the right side of the table, basically talk quickly about function. Function, of course, is one of the things is to protect you, protect from the weather, protect from injury, protect you when you're in an activity. And the firefighter's hat in the back is made out of a black leather, and that type of hat was actually developed by a gentleman in the 1820s who owned a company that made luggage for seafaring, for ocean voyages. So he knew a technique that you could basically keep the leather protected from moisture. So they adopted that for the helmet. The brim that goes down to the back of the neck covers the neck from having water run down the back of your neck. That hat is about from 1880. It's worn by a local Sacramento firefighter in engine house number 3. And it's great because the emblem on the front tells us that he was in engine house number 3. And actually those badges or insignias were developed by a company that made badges and insignia, and they were like, well, what can we do to increase our sales? And they'd seen the fire hat and they thought, great way to put that, to let people know who you were, what department you were with, and also make us money. The little eagle that you see kind of behind the crown is a decoration that you see frequently on hats from this time period, but it really has no symbolic meaning. Originally, it was made, a sculptor put it on a monument for a fallen firefighter, and he just decided he liked an eagle, and he added it onto his firefighter's hat, and other firefighters saw it and said, oh, great, we're going to add it too. But the problem is that it would always get caught on things. And so they disliked them because they were an annoyance, but, it became a symbolic thing then for them eventually.
So essentially that's just there to physically hold the top of the
well,
shield
no, yes and no. I mean, they're actually separate. I mean, you can have the shield without having the eagle and vice versa, yeah. The mask you see in front of that's a fencing mask from about 1920. So many sporting activities, you have either a hat or something that covers your face and your head to protect you when you're playing sports. The other thing is protect you from danger or having things fall on your head. There we go. We've got two examples of what we would call early hard hats. The first is actually a straw Chinese miner's hat. Now that, I don't know how much protection that actually afforded, but that was one of its uses. And that was actually sold by a company in San Francisco. They started selling miners' hats to gold miners when the gold mines rush started in the 1850s. That company then went on to develop the metal hard hats and then subsequently the plastic hard hats that we're familiar with. And what they developed was that suspension system inside the hat. That basically is the thing that helps prevent the, cushions the blow and helps you actually protect that. That particular yellow hat is from Civil Defense here in Sacramento.
That's a steel one, not a fiberglass one?
That's a steel one.
Yeah. Leftovers from World War II.
Those are, that one was, after the Civil Defense, after all the World War II, the nuclear bomb era. These two pieces here on the front are some of our oldest pieces. These are both from about the 1850s. This one is quilted, so it's got a filling in it, and then the filling, it's been stitched down to keep the filling from shifting, and so this would be worn for warmth. It's got a nice back curtain, a bevelette that would also protect you from the cold. Now, the thing I like about this one is that this was what's called a calash, C-A-L-A-S-H, and it's basically a folding bonnet. First of all, well, it's got a couple things that it does. It's high, and it would have protected your hairdo, and it folded, as I said, for travel. The other thing is some of the early versions would have ribbons sewn here so that it would help you pull down the hat to keep the wind off of your face. What I find interesting about this is that this was probably made from a fabric that's known as, that was dyed with something called arsenic green. Arsenic green was a byproduct of the smelting industry, and it became a really popular, arsenic became very popular in the early 1800s, and they used it in everything. They used it in writing paper, they used it in wallpaper, they used it in textiles. The problem being that it had arsenic in it. When it was made, when people wore it as dresses and women sweat, they would absorb it in their skin. When they had in other things like bonnets or any other thing close to your skin, it also would flake and you could inhale the arsenic. One of my favorite things is a doctor started investigating this. People started dying from arsenic poisoning, and he went and collected samples of wallpaper that was made with arsenic and put a book together called The Wallpapers of Death. Oh. And The Wallpapers of Death actually has samples of wallpaper from that time period, and he talks about the fact that arsenic deaths were occurring from all this stuff that was used around the home. That arsenic went out of, luckily went out of use when aniline dyes, synthetic dyes, started to be developed after that, about the late 1850s.
Was it always that colored?
Well, they've got different names for it. They refer to it as emerald green sometimes, and people didn't call it, I'm going to go get an arsenic green hat. The name of it, besides emerald green, there was a person's name also.
But the arsenic was always green, some kind of green. Yes.
In the back here, on this side, we have symbolic headwear. This gold lame crown and the gown were worn by a girl in the Portuguese American community that was picked to be Miss Liberty every year in the Portuguese festivals. And so what I find interesting is that the Portuguese American community, you've got recent immigrants and first generation people who are showing that they're both Portuguese and American. They're personifying it by Miss Liberty. And there's Miss Liberty about 1930 with Miss Portugal next to her. Mourning, is a very symbolic aspect that's shown through your outward appearance. And hats and clothing was one of the ways that you showed mourning. And the amount of, excuse me, you basically, depending on the closeness of relationship to the person that died, you went through different levels of mourning, showed different degrees. And you showed that by basically your outward appearance, which is you wanted to stay really dull and use fabrics that didn't have a lot of sheen or color to them. The word crepe was developed having to do with mourning. So when you were first mourning, your deepest mourning, you would wear a hat like this, which was very plain. There were certain fabrics that you were restricted to wearing. Then as you moved up, as the time progressed, you were able to add other things like some colors. Oh, I can't take that one off. Velvets, you could add some sheen like satin. And then again, as you progressed along in your mourning, you could start adding colors like lavender and magenta, so that you were showing the outside world that you were progressing in your mourning. A bridal headdress, Queen Victoria, she's always said to be the person that is kind of the one that started the fad for white wedding dresses, because she wore a white wedding dress. She also wore orange blossoms. Orange blossoms had always been worn as headdresses, but she had one. And so orange blossoms and headwear became very popular. These are actually made out of wax. And then the flowers themselves are made out of cloth. I like this because in the late 1800s, there was this vogue for Orientalism. If you knew about the world outside of America, and you showed that you were worldly, that you knew what was going on. And one of the ways that people did that was to show off by showing the use of Oriental motifs and symbols. People would make what they called Turkish corners in their houses, and they would pick a spot in their house and they would put all this drapery, and they'd get ottomans and they'd swords, and that was their Turkish corner. Well, another way they showed that they knew about this Orientalism, men would put on their smoking jackets, their very Oriental looking smoking jacket, and their smoking caps. And then they would either have a room set aside, maybe their Turkish corner, or they'd go to the club and they would smoke. And so not only was it showing people that you had the wealth to be able to have these things, but also that you knew about the outside world, that you were worldly. And you were also protecting your hat and your hair from smoke. I like this one with the red. It's got embroidery on it. It's a tennis racket and a tennis net. Don't know why. We didn't get that information when we got it, but these little hats were popular for women to make because they were easy to make. All the women's magazines gave you directions for it, and women would give them to their husbands or fiancés as presents. It was a handiwork kind of thing. The last section I'm going to talk about is basically a headwear can tell you about organizations that you belong to. Most people are familiar, if we can get people to come over here. I'm sorry this is so crowded in here. When we were setting this up, 20 people didn't seem like a lot, but you get 20 people in here now. One of the things that we're probably all most familiar with are things like how military headwear can really designate what organization you're with or what rank you are. Each of the branches has its own shapes and colors and insignia. This hat up here is from the 1890s. It's a military hat, men's military hat. It's got an eagle embroidered with what's called bullion, which is a gold thread, and the straps on the front would also indicate your rank and your level within the organization. I have a picture here when you walk by that just shows how that hat would be worn with a uniform at that time. Thing I like over here, again, police uniforms. That's certainly something that's recognizable to everyone. It tells you what kind of organization you're in. This hat was worn by a woman. This was worn by Officer Delora Sutter, and the great thing about this is that Delora was the first female sergeant on the Sacramento Police Department. She was on the police department from the 50s through the 70s. I talked a little bit about the Polish-American heritage Cultural Society back with Miss Liberty. Well, they had a lot of parades, festivals through the years. This is a marching band cap from the Camellia City Marching Band, which was part of that Portuguese American community. One gentleman played a bunch of different instruments in the band and participated in parades throughout the city. The crown was worn by the queen of the Ghost Festival. And basically, the crown represented Queen Isabella. And so one girl would be selected to be the queen, and she would parade through the streets in a tiara. And then when she actually got into church, they put the crown on the top of her head. It was very symbolic. And really the only time that she wore it was in church, which is why it's got that, it looks really small. You know, she didn't walk around on. It's on a plate right now. It's on its own salver. So, and there is a picture of her. I can't reach, unfortunately. There's a picture of one of the first queens back in 1904. You can see. That would be wonderful. Thank you so much. Last couple things I want to talk about. Everyone recognizes a nurse's cap. And this is a nurse's cap from the 1940s, worn by a woman who was a nurse's aide in Sutter Hospital. It's funny, that we're so used to seeing that cap that even though nurses don't wear it now, all you have to do is see that shape and you instantly recognize it as a nurse. Even see movies today where I remember seeing one, and even though I haven't seen a nurse in a hat like that in years, they still had one on there. It's like, that's just to give us this idea, again, this instantaneous recognition. The Shriners caps, these are all owned by the same gentleman as he worked his way through the Shriners organization. So they represent the organization. The thing I love about the Shriners is it harkens back to the Orientalism. This started in the 1880s. The Shriners started in the 1880s. A couple of members of the Masons wanted a fun organization. So they started the Shriners. And what they decided is one of the gentlemen had been on a trip to the Orient. And when he came back, he thought, well, if we're going to start this organization, let's use some Oriental symbols. And so they adopted things like, the Egyptian Sphinx and the scimitar. The hat they chose is very Middle Eastern. It's the fez. It's a truncated cone. And the fez is named after the city in Monaco, Fez, Monaco. They were known for that shape, and also because they had the recipe for the red color of the fez. So this hat shows people outside of the organization that you're a member of the Shriners, but then also depending on the kind of jewels or whichever type of insignia you had on the hat, like military, it tells other people within the Shriners what level you're at. And then the last two hats here, which I just think this is fun because it kind of shows you the extent to which hats have influence. This black riding hat, this shape started when people would go out for hunts, on horses and would hunt. And the hunt master would wear a cap, and he was the only one that could have ribbons trailing down the back of his hat. Everyone else's ribbons pointed up. The trailing ribbons indicated he was the leader, that you had to follow what he said. So that design held through then on the caps and has become part of basically the costume of horse riding. Thank you, Sigrid. This was worn by Mrs. Winchester Felt when she was in competitions and different horse events in Sacramento. She purchased the hat at Sacramento Saddlery, which was a supplier here in Sacramento in the early 60s. And then when she wasn't actually in competitions or involved in actual demonstrations, she wore her fun yellow feather hat, one of my favorites. I just think this is such a great big bird hat.
I'm sure the dress that went with it was just equally as loud.
We didn't get the outfit. I would have loved to have seen the outfit. The thing that she liked is she thought it was fun. Why did her husband like it?
Because he could find her.
Exactly. He could always find her in the crowd when she wore this hat. So,
where would they wear that? Like the grocery store or the dance or the church? Or
wherever you wanted to wear it. I mean, it's when the 60s people wore hats.
But yeah, but you're right. Wearing that to the track on a track day and your husband's looking for you.
Right.
There she is.
Yeah, or they're in a big crowd during a show or something. Oh, there she is. Yeah. Yeah, sure. You dressed up. Yeah, church. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. Well, she said this was her fun hat. So I think probably for her when she was doing fun things, you know, I don't, you know.
How old was she roughly when in that period? You know.
You know, I don't know. I don't have her.
It reminds me of my grandmother. Talks about her mother, and very stern German Jew, very proper. But she had this little childish whimsy, and she would wear things like that on special occasions.
Okay. Well, this is actually a very, very typical shape from the 60s. I mean, that was a mod shape actually for the 60s, and that's when this hat was worn. It was in the early 60s because we know from the receipts that she bought this hat in the early 60s. So that,
Would have been an A-line dress.
probably, yeah, yeah. I see.
In a complementary color, yellow.
One
pale
could
yellow.
only hope.
Yeah.
Hate to see something that wasn't. So, okay, well, that is the end of our tour. I want to thank you all for coming. If you have any questions, please ask. I see someone's waving.
I just wondered, do you have collections of purses also?
We do. We have collections of purses and hats, and this is our first annual textile tour. This is our first opportunity to share these with you, and we've decided next year it's going to be purses and hats.
No, she said
No,
shoes.
did I say purses and hats? Shoes and purses next year. Yes.
Just a question. Is there a maker's mark inside the officer's hat here?
I can't remember. I'd have to look. I don't. It might be Pasquale, which
Oh, okay,
is
which is in San
which is San Francisco. I'm pretty sure it
I
is.
kind of figured it probably would.
Yeah.